She was not supposed to be there. That was the first thing Sable told herself when she heard the screaming begin. The high-pitched shriek of a noblewoman followed by the thunderous crash of hooves against packed earth, and the collective gasp of 500 witnesses who had gathered in the royal arena to watch history be made. She was not supposed to be there. She was supposed to be invisible, the way she had always been invisible, the way daughters of dead soldiers with no wolf and no rank and no family name worth speaking were expected to remain invisible inside the kingdom of Vordenmere. But the eastern stable gate had been left unlatched, and the hay bales needed stacking before the afternoon ceremonies, and no one else had bothered to come, so Sable had come instead, because that was what she did. She came when no one else would. She pressed herself against the rough stone wall near the service corridor, and watched through the iron grating as Lady Corinna of the Ashburn line was thrown from the back of a horse that should not have been able to throw anyone. Arkan was not an ordinary horse. Everyone in Vordenmere knew that. Everyone in the entire lycanthropic continent of Eldara knew that. The war horse of the ancient kings had been sealed inside the royal stables for 217 years, waiting, the old text said, for the one who carried the right blood, the right soul, the right everything that the goddess Vera had decreed must exist before a new era could begin. He was enormous, and black as a starless sky, and his eyes burned with a light that had no natural explanation, a low amber glow that pulsed like a coal that refused to go cold. He was beautiful, the way dangerous things were beautiful, the way lightning was beautiful when it split a tree directly in half. And right now, he was standing in the center of the ceremonial arena, with his head low and his nostrils flared, and the look in those ember eyes was something that Sable, who had cared for horses her entire life, could only describe as deeply unimpressed. Lady Corinna was being helped to her feet by two attendants, her silk gown torn at the shoulder, her elaborate coiffure collapsed entirely on one side. She was the fourth candidate to be thrown this morning. The fourth. Before her had come Lady Mirae of the Stonecrest bloodline, who had lasted approximately 4 seconds in the saddle, before Arkan simply walked sideways and deposited her onto the arena floor with almost contemptuous gentleness. Before Mirae had come Lady Thessaly, who had not even managed to mount before the horse turned his back on her, with a finality that drew uncomfortable laughter from the crowd that the court herald had to quickly silence. And before Thessaly, in the very first ceremony of the morning, had come Lady Vivian Ashford herself, the most politically powerful candidate on the continent, the woman that half the noble houses of Eldara had already begun addressing as future Luna Queen in their private correspondence, the woman whose family had spent 11 months and an obscene amount of gold preparing for this exact moment. Vivian had lasted 6 seconds. Sable had counted. She had not meant to count. She had not meant to watch at all. But the arena was adjacent to the eastern stables, and the sounds carried clearly through the stone corridors, and Sable had found herself drawn to the grating, the way she always found herself drawn to horses in distress. Because there was something in the quality of Arkan's movements that she had been reading since she was 8 years old, and first assigned to the outer paddocks, where the older stable hands sent children to keep them out of the way. The quality of his movements said he was not distressed. He was not frightened or wild or overwhelmed by the crowd and the noise and the ceremonial incense that the priests had been burning since dawn. He was deliberate. Every rejection had been deliberate. Measured, almost gentle in its certainty. He was not lashing out. He was refusing. There was a difference, and Sable felt that difference in her chest like a tuning fork struck against something she could not name. The right of choosing will resume after a brief recess, the court herald announced from his elevated platform, his voice carrying the particular strained cheerfulness of a man who was professionally obligated to sound confident, even when everything was going badly. His Majesty requests that all candidates return to the preparation chambers. The afternoon session will commence at the 3rd bell. The crowd noise shifted, the low murmur of 500 opinions all expressed simultaneously, and Sable watched through the grating as the nobility of Eldara began sorting itself into conversational clusters the way powerful people always did when something had not gone according to plan, and alliances needed rapid reassessment. She watched Vivian Ashford cross the arena floor toward the royal pavilion, and she noted, because she noticed things even when she should not, that Vivian was not embarrassed. She was not crying or shaking or showing any of the vulnerability that the other rejected candidates had displayed. She walked with her spine perfectly straight and her chin at an angle that communicated absolute control. And the only sign that anything had gone wrong at all was in her hands, which were folded in front of her body so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Vivian Ashford was furious. She was simply very, very good at not showing it. Sable did not have strong feelings about Lady Vivian one way or the other. She did not have strong feelings about most of the nobility. It was easier that way. Her father had taught her that before he died. Or rather, his death had taught her that. The lesson arriving without words the way the most permanent lessons always did. He had given 17 years of his life to the Vordenmere military, had bled for the throne and for the pack, had believed in the hierarchy with the straightforward faith of a man who understood his place and found meaning in it. And when he died in a border skirmish that was never officially acknowledged, the pack had given his daughter a position in the stables and a small room in the servants' wing, and not a single thing more. No pension, no recognition, no name in any official record of the fallen. Just a broom and a bucket, and the understanding, conveyed without any cruelty, but with absolute clarity, that she was to be grateful for what she had been given. So Sable was grateful. Or she performed gratitude well enough that no one looked too closely at what lay beneath it. She was still watching Arkin through the grating when she realized he was watching her back. The horse had turned his enormous head toward the iron grating where she stood in the shadow of the service corridor, and those ember eyes were fixed on her with an attention so direct and so focused that she felt it physically, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. She did not move. She had learned very young that you did not make sudden movements around animals who were paying that quality of attention to you. You breathed slowly, and you held still, and you let them take your measure in their own time, because the worst thing you could do was make them feel that you were afraid of being seen. Sable was not afraid of being seen by a horse. She was afraid of a great many things, but not that. Arkin held her gaze for a long moment. Then he took 3 slow steps toward the grating, and she heard the crowd noise around the arena shift and quiet slightly, the nearest observers registering the change in the horse's attention and uncertain what to make of it. She did not move. She breathed. She watched him the way she always watched horses, with the full and undivided attention that most of the people in this arena would never offer to an animal that was not performing for them. And she thought, without quite meaning to think it, that he was tired. Not physically tired. Something deeper. The kind of tired that came from waiting a very long time for something that kept not arriving. "I know," she said quietly. So quietly that no one outside the corridor could have heard her. "I know what that feels like." Arkin pressed his nose against the iron grating. The metal was cold and rough, and he should not have been able to reach her through it. But she felt the warmth of his breath on her fingertips anyway, and something in her chest did something she did not have a word for. It was not the mate bond. She did not have a wolf. Whatever she had felt in that moment was something else. Something older, maybe. Something that predated the classifications of rank and power and blood status that defined every relationship in Vordenmere. He recognized her. She did not know how she knew that. She simply knew it the way she knew when a horse was in pain, or when a storm was coming, or when the ground beneath her feet was less solid than it appeared. Stable hand. The voice came from behind her, sharp and authoritative, and Sable pulled her fingers back from the grating and turned. One of the royal stewards stood in the corridor entrance, a thin man with a clipboard, and the expression of someone who had been managing logistics under pressure for too many consecutive hours. "What are you doing in the observation corridor?" This area is restricted during the rite. The eastern gate was unlatched, she said. I came to stack the hay bales. I can leave. You should have left 20 minutes ago. He made a notation on his clipboard with the energy of a man who was going to make someone else's morning worse in order to improve his own. Get back to the outer paddocks. The afternoon candidates will need the arena cleared before the third bell. Yes, sir, she said, and meant nothing by it in either direction, and went back to work. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. She did not think about Arkin for the rest of the morning. Or rather, she thought about him in the specific way she thought about things she was not supposed to think about, which meant she did the hay bales and checked the water levels in the outer troughs and repaired the latch on the eastern gate with a piece of wire she kept in her pocket for exactly this kind of purpose. And all the while she was doing these things, her mind kept circling back to the pressure of warm breath against her fingers and the quality of recognition in those burning eyes, and the way the crowd noise had shifted when he moved toward her. She did not do anything with these thoughts. She had a great deal of practice at having thoughts she did nothing with. The third bell rang. The afternoon session of the rite of choosing began. Sable heard the outcome from the outer paddocks, where sound traveled freely across the open ground between the outbuildings. She heard 3 more crashes of hooves and 3 more sets of exclamations from the crowd, and by the time the final bell rang to close the afternoon session, and the herald's distant voice announced that the rite would continue the following morning, she had finished her work and was washing her hands at the outer pump and trying very hard not to feel anything specific about any of it. 7 candidates, said a voice to her, left, and she looked up to find Oswin, one of the senior stable masters, settling himself onto the fence rail with the comfortable gravity of a man sharing important news. Oswin was 63 years old, and had worked in the Vordenmere royal stables since before the current king had been born, and he had opinions about everything, and shared them freely with anyone who stood still long enough to receive them. Sable liked him. He was one of perhaps 4 people in the entirety of Vordenmere who spoke to her as though her presence in a conversation was a reasonable thing. 7 candidates thrown or refused. Not a single one he tolerated for more than 10 seconds. Lady Ashford's people are in absolute crisis. I heard from Bren in the kitchens that her advisor spent 2 hours in a closed room with 3 court historians trying to find precedent for challenging the horse's judgment. Is there precedent? Sable asked, not because she particularly wanted to know, but because Oswin would tell her either way, and it was more efficient to ask. There is not, Oswin said, with the satisfaction of a man who had already researched this himself. The right of choosing is considered a direct expression of divine will. You cannot challenge divine will on procedural grounds. The texts are quite clear. He paused, scratching the back of his neck. What is less clear is what happens if the right fails entirely. If Arkin refuses every candidate. No one has written instructions for that scenario because no one believed it was possible. The assumption was always that the right woman would present herself, that the goddess would not call for a rite without having already chosen someone to fulfill it. Maybe she chose someone who did not register as a candidate, Sable said, which was not a thought she had meant to say out loud. Oswin looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite categorize. That is a more interesting theory than anything the court historians came up with, he said. Get some rest, girl. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. It was longer than he had predicted. The morning of the second day brought 9 more candidates, women from bloodlines so ancient and so carefully cultivated that their family trees looked like architectural blueprints, and Arkin refused every single one of them before noon. The refusing had become almost theatrical in its consistency, not because the horse was performing, but because the crowd had developed expectations and each new rejection confirmed them, and there was a specific kind of collective disappointment that settled over the arena between candidates. A disappointed silence that lasted until the next name was called, and the next woman walked forward, and the next inevitable conclusion was reached. By the third candidate of the morning, some members of the audience had stopped pretending they were watching in hope, and had begun watching with the specific fascinated attention people gave to a disaster they could not look away from. Sable watched none of it. She had work to do. She was in the inner stable corridor at midday, moving a load of clean bedding to the stalls that would house the visiting noble's horses for the duration of the rite, when she turned a corner and found herself face to face with King Kalin of Vordenmere. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone in the kingdom had seen him. He had been crowned at 22 after his father's death, had governed with a steadiness that bordered on severity, had fought 4 border engagements in his first 3 years of rule, and won all of them with a combination of tactical precision and personal ferocity that had made the neighboring kingdoms reconsider the quality of their own military preparedness. He was 31 now, and he looked it in the way that people who had been carrying real weight for years looked their age, not old, but settled into himself in a way that younger men were not, the particular solidity of someone who had been tested repeatedly and had not collapsed. He was tall. She had known that from a distance. Up close it registered differently, the way all abstract knowledge registered differently when it became immediate and physical, and standing 3 feet away from you, in a stable corridor with hay dust in the air and the smell of horses everywhere. He was also, quite clearly, not supposed to be in this corridor. He had the look of a man who had escaped something, the slightly loosened quality of a person who had stepped away from a room full of obligations and was taking a moment to exist without being watched. His crown was absent. He was wearing a plain dark coat over riding clothes. He had a small cut on his jaw from shaving that morning that no one had thought to tell him about, or that he had not bothered to address. Sable stopped. She shifted the bundle of bedding in her arms and stepped to the side of the corridor to allow him to pass. It was the correct thing to do. You moved out of the way of the king. This was not complicated. He did not pass. He looked at the bundle of bedding in her arms and then at her face, and she watched the moment when he registered that she was a servant, and then the separate moment when he registered that she had not looked away from him, which was apparently unexpected enough to hold his attention for a beat longer than the standard dismissal. "You work in the inner stables," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. "How long?" "Since I was 13, Your Majesty. 8 years." He looked at her for another moment, with an expression that she could not fully read, which was unusual. She was generally good at reading faces, having spent most of her life in the position of needing to understand what people wanted from her without being told directly. His face was the face of a man who had learned to control what it communicated, but there was something underneath the control. Something that had been sitting in him for a while and had not found resolution, and it surfaced briefly in the line of his mouth before he put it away again. "Do you have an opinion about what is happening in the arena?" he said. The question surprised her enough that she answered honestly, which she would not have done if she had been given more time to think. "I think he is telling the truth," she said. "Horses always tell the truth. People just do not always understand the language." The king was quiet for a moment. "And what is the truth he is telling?" "That none of them are who he is waiting for," she said. "That he knows the difference, and that he is willing to wait as long as necessary rather than accept a substitute." She paused. "He has been waiting for 200 years. I do not think he is worried about a few more days." Kalin looked at her for a long time. She held still and looked back, because she did not have a wolf, but she had a spine, and she had learned young that looking down when someone powerful met your eyes was a habit that, once formed, was very difficult to break. "What is your name?" he said. "Sable Voss, Your Majesty. My father was Lieutenant Devon Voss, 3rd Border Regiment." Something moved across his face at that. Brief, and then gone. "I know that name," he said, and she believed him, because his voice had the quality of someone reaching for a real memory rather than manufacturing one. "He died in the Ashfeld skirmish." "Yes, Your Majesty." "I am sorry for that," he said. And this also she believed. which was not what she had expected to believe in a corridor with hay dust on her clothes and bedding in her arms. She had rehearsed conversations with royalty in the privacy of her own mind, the way people who would never have such conversations sometimes did, and none of those rehearsals had included genuine condolences delivered without ceremony in a service passage. She chose to say nothing, which was usually the safer option. And he accepted this without apparent offense and moved past her down the corridor. And she stood for a moment afterward and tried to return to being invisible as quickly as possible, because invisible was safe, and she had a great deal more bedding to move before evening. It was the steward who ruined it, or rather it was the eastern gate again, the same gate she had repaired the previous day with a piece of wire, because the wire had not held, and Arkan had simply walked through it. He had not run. He had walked, with the unhurried certainty of something that knew exactly where it was going, through the inner stable yard and directly toward the far corner, where Sable was finishing the evening water checks with her back turned to him. She heard the quiet behind her first. The specific quality of quiet that happened when a large animal was very close and very still. She turned slowly. Arkan was standing 6 feet away. His ember eyes were bright in the late afternoon light, and he was watching her with the same focused attention he had given her through the grating the previous morning, and he was breathing slowly, deliberately, in a way that she recognized as a horse making itself calm, rather than a horse that was already calm. He was working at something that mattered. "You came a long way," she said softly. He took a step forward, then another. He stopped when his nose was perhaps a foot from her shoulder, and he lowered his head slightly, the way a horse did when it was extending trust rather than requesting something. And Sable stood very still and let him close the remaining distance at his own pace. His nose touched her shoulder. She felt the warmth of it through the fabric of her work shirt, through her skin, down through something she did not have adequate language for. And the thing in her chest that had no name did the same nameless thing it had done the day before. Larger this time, wider, like a door opening that she had not known was a door. "What are you doing?" she whispered, not frightened but genuinely uncertain, genuinely asking, the way she asked animals questions even when she knew they would not answer in words, because the question itself was part of the contact, part of the conversation that happened without language. Arkan lifted his head and looked at her face, and she looked back at him and understood, in the wordless way that she understood horses, that he was answering her. He was telling her exactly what he was doing. She simply could not allow herself to believe it yet. The sound of boots on packed earth came from somewhere behind her, and she turned to find 3 royal guards crossing the outer paddock at speed, followed by the thin steward from the previous day, looking both relieved and alarmed, and behind him, walking at a pace that was not quite running but conveyed urgency nonetheless, was King Kalen. "Back away from the horse," the first guard called out. "Do not," said the king quietly, and the guard stopped as though a string had been cut. "What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." The silence in the outer paddock had a specific texture. Sable could feel it against her skin. She could feel Arkan behind her, warm and present, and completely untroubled by the arrival of guards and stewards and kings, as though he had anticipated exactly this outcome and found it satisfactory. She kept her breathing steady. She kept her face composed. She was acutely aware of the hay dust still on her clothes from the morning and the fact that she had not changed, and the further fact that she was standing in the outer paddock of the royal stables being looked at by the King of Vordenmere with an expression she had no framework for interpreting. "Sable Voss," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath the control that had not been there in the corridor, something with more pressure behind it, something that was working harder to stay contained. "Do not move." "I was not planning to, Your Majesty," she said. He crossed the paddock slowly, stopping at a distance that a man of his rank and position should not have needed to stop at, close enough that she could see the cut on his jaw again, and the tension in the line of his shoulders, and the quality of attention in his gray eyes that she was having significant difficulty processing, because it was the same quality of attention that Arkin was giving her, and she did not know what to do with it from two directions at once. He looked past her at the horse, and she saw something move across his face that had no name she recognized, something complicated and raw and entirely uncourtly. And then he looked back at her. "He has not done that," he said, and his voice was careful, very careful, the careful of someone managing their own response in real time. "With any of the candidates. He has not approached any of them voluntarily. He has not touched any of them." "I know," she said. "I was watching yesterday morning through the grating." "You were watching from the grating." He repeated this as though it was information that required additional processing. "And he came to you through the grating." "He breathed on my fingers," she said. "I did not do anything to encourage it. I was only watching." Kaelin was quiet for a moment. She could hear the steward behind him making small, agitated sounds that he was suppressing out of professional obligation. She could hear the distant crowd noise from the arena, where, presumably, the afternoon session of the rite was still ongoing and producing its predictable results. She could feel Arkin's presence behind her like a source of warmth in a cold room, steady and certain and entirely unhurried. "I need to ask you something," the king said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "I will try, Your Majesty." "Do you have a wolf?" She held his gaze. "No, Your Majesty. I have never manifested. I am unmated and without wolf status." She said it the way she always said it when it was relevant, flatly, without apology or performance of shame, because she had long since decided that performing shame about things she had not chosen and could not change was a waste of energy she did not have. "I am aware that disqualifies me from consideration under the terms of the rite." "The terms of the rite," he said slowly, "were written 200 years ago by men who made a great many assumptions about what was possible and what was not." He paused. "Arkin does not appear to be observing those terms. With respect, Your Majesty, Arkin has not observed any of the terms since the rite began. I do not think he is particularly concerned with the written protocols." Something happened to Kaelin's expression that she could not fully categorize. It was not quite a smile, but it moved in the direction of one before he caught it and returned it to neutrality. And the fact that he had almost smiled made her feel something. She very firmly put away before she could examine it too closely. "No," he said. "I do not suppose he is." He looked at her for another long moment, the kind of looking that had weight behind it, the kind that she felt against her skin. "Will you come to the arena tomorrow morning? Not as a candidate, just to be present. I want to see what he does." She should have said no. She should have cited her duties and her lack of qualification and the considerable political complications that would arise from a servant girl with no wolf presenting herself at the rite of choosing. She knew all of this. She said it to herself clearly and in order. And then she looked at the king standing in her paddock at the end of a long and unsuccessful day. And she felt Arkin warm behind her shoulder, and she said, "Yes, Your Majesty." She regretted this at approximately 3 a.m, lying awake on her narrow bed going through the list of everything that could go wrong. She regretted it again. At 6, when she rose and washed her face and looked at herself in the small clouded mirror, and tried to imagine what she was supposed to wear to stand inside a royal arena and be observed by a magic horse and a king and 500 members of the Eldarin nobility. She did not own anything designed for being looked at. Everything she owned was designed for working in. She wore her cleanest work shirt and her good boots, and braided her dark hair back from her face. And she told herself, with the particular pragmatic stubbornness that had gotten her through most of the difficult situations of her life, that she would go and stand there and nothing would happen, and everyone would feel slightly foolish, and she would go back to her work, and the right would continue with its registered candidates, and the question of the horse would eventually resolve itself in some way that the court historians could reconcile with the existing texts. This was the most likely outcome. She was certain of it. She arrived at the arena before the gates opened to the general audience. A young guard she did not recognize checked a list, found her name on it, and admitted her to a waiting area inside the north entrance that she had never accessed before. The room was clean and simply furnished and smelled of cedar, and she sat on a bench and folded her hands in her lap and breathed steadily and tried not to think about the fact that her name was on a list that someone had written, presumably by order of the king, which meant that this had been considered and arranged and was not something she could still easily step back from. The door to the waiting area opened and Lady Vivian Ashford came through it. Sable recognized her immediately, which was unavoidable since Vivian's face had been on decorative banners in the market quarter for the past 2 weeks ahead of the rite, a promotional effort funded by the Ashford family that the palace had permitted, because politically it had seemed impolitic to refuse. Vivian was exactly as beautiful as the banners suggested, which was to say precisely and deliberately beautiful, in the way that people who understood beauty as a form of power were beautiful, every element of her appearance calibrated for maximum impact. She had golden hair arranged in a style that managed to look both formal and effortless. She had blue eyes the color of deep water. She was wearing a pale green gown that probably cost more than Sable's annual wages, and she wore it with the ease of a woman who had never in her life worn anything that did not cost more than Sable's annual wages. She looked at Sable for a moment, in which no readable emotion crossed her face. Then she sat down on the bench on the opposite side of the room and arranged her skirts and said, with the particular pleasantness that people deployed when they intended something other than pleasantness, "You are the stable girl." "I work in the stables, yes," Sable said. "I have heard." "About yesterday evening," Vivian said. "I have heard about the horse in the paddock." She paused. "I imagine this must all feel quite overwhelming. The sudden attention. The unusual situation." "It is a bit unusual," Sable agreed. Vivian looked at her with those deep water eyes, and Sable looked back, and there was a moment between them that had nothing to do with words. A moment in which two people took an honest measure of each other and reached their respective conclusions. Sable's conclusion was that Lady Vivian Ashford was extremely intelligent, fully in control of herself, and operating from a position of significant threat that she was managing with extraordinary composure. She was also, Sable suspected, someone who had built her entire future around a specific outcome, and was currently watching that outcome become uncertain in ways she had not planned for. "You should understand something," Vivian said, and her voice had not changed its pleasant quality, but the pleasantness had become thinner, more transparent, like a veneer under pressure. "The political alliances that would accompany my selection as Luna Queen took 11 years to build. The treaty with the Halveth coalition depends on my position here. The stability of 4 border provinces rests in part on my family's relationship with the throne. These are not small things. These are not matters of personal preference." She paused. Whatever the horse may or may not have done in a paddock with a girl who cleans stalls, the structures of this kingdom are not built on animal intuition. "I am not trying to threaten your position, Lady Ashford," Sable said. "No," Vivian said. "I do not suppose you are." She stood, smoothing her skirts with a gesture of complete self-possession. "That does not mean you do not." She left through a different door. Sable sat with the cedar smell and the morning light coming through the high window, and breathed through the particular feeling of having been assessed and found dangerous by someone with real power, which was a new experience, and not entirely unpleasant in the way that she would have expected, and this told her something about herself that she filed away for later consideration. The herald's voice called the morning session open. A guard appeared at Sable's door. "His Majesty requests that you take a position at the arena floor, near the eastern gate." The guard paused, clearly uncertain about the correct level of protocol for this situation. If you are willing." "I am willing," she said, and followed him down the corridor toward the light. She walked out onto the arena floor and felt 500 pairs of eyes find her, and she kept walking. The sand was golden under her boots, and the morning sun was sharp and clean, and the arena smelled of horses and incense, and the collective anticipatory energy of a large crowd that had not gotten what it came for and was hopeful again. She did not look at the royal pavilion, where she was aware the king was seated, and she did not look at the noble stands where the remaining candidates were arranged in order of precedence. And she did not look at anyone in particular, because looking at anyone in particular required receiving their expression in return, and she did not have enough internal resources to manage that right now. She walked to the eastern gate position, indicated by the guard, and she stopped, and she stood there, and she breathed. The court priest raised his ceremonial staff. "The right of choosing continues," he announced. "By the will of the goddess Vera, Arkan the war horse shall indicate the one who carries the Luna's soul. Let the gates be opened." The western gate opened. Arkan came through it. He was magnificent in the morning light, enormous and dark and burning, and the crowd made a low sound of collective awe that was entirely involuntary. The kind of sound that very beautiful and very powerful things drew from human throats whether people wanted to make it or not. He walked to the center of the arena and stopped, and raised his head, and looked at the assembled nobility and the stands and the candidates section with those amber eyes that saw everything, and the crowd fell completely silent. The silence was total. It was the silence of a held breath, of 500 people understanding simultaneously that something was happening that would be spoken about for a very long time. Arkan turned his head. He looked at Sable. He walked toward her. He did not rush. He did not trot or canter or demonstrate any of the physical power that she knew he possessed. He walked with the slow and absolute certainty of a thing that had been waiting for this moment for 217 years, and found it to be exactly as it had been promised. He walked to where she stood, and stopped in front of her, and lowered his great head until his forehead touched her shoulder, and the contact was so gentle and so enormous at the same time that she felt her throat tighten with something she refused to let become tears, because she was standing in a public arena in front of 500 people, and she had limits. The silence lasted for 3 more seconds. Then the noise began. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. She heard the noise as a physical thing, a wave of sound that broke over the arena from multiple directions at once. Some of it shock, and some of it awe, and some of it an excitement that had nowhere to go yet, and was expressing itself simply as volume. She heard the distinct sound of at least 2 people dropping things. She heard the court priest make a sound that was not in any official capacity. She kept her hand on Arkan's neck, which was where it had gone the moment he had come close to her, naturally, without decision, the way her hands always went to horses, and she felt his warmth under her palm, and his steadiness, and she breathed. She heard, under all, the other sounds, the king's voice. He was not speaking loudly, but his voice carried anyway, the way voices that were accustomed to being obeyed carried even at low volume. He said one word, "Enough." And the noise did not stop, but it modulated. It lowered itself. It recognized the edge in that word and stepped back from it. Sable made herself look up. Made herself look at the royal pavilion where Kalen stood at the railing, not seated as the ceremony required, his hands gripping the carved stone of the rail with a pressure she could see from the arena floor. He was looking at her with an expression she did not have a word for. Not because she was bad at reading faces, but because the face he was making was not one she had a category for. It was something between recognition and something much larger, something that looked like it was happening to him, rather than being chosen by him. And she understood with a clarity that arrived without preamble that the mate bond she did not have, a wolf to feel, was being felt by one of them, and the one who was feeling it was him. She looked away before she did something inadvisable. She looked at Arkin's neck under her hand and breathed very carefully. The court priest descended from his platform with the specific urgency of a man who needed the situation to come with him. "The rite recognizes," he announced, his voice only slightly unsteady, "a selection. The goddess Vera has indicated her choice. The rite of choosing is complete." He paused. "The candidate must be formally presented to His Majesty." "She is not a registered candidate," said a voice from the noble stands, cool and precise, with the accent of someone who had been schooled in diction. Sable did not need to look to know the voice. She had been in a room with it for 10 minutes this morning. "The terms of the rite do not specify registration as a precondition of selection," the priest said, with the tone of someone who had been doing research overnight. "The rite recognizes the soul, not the name on a list." Another voice from elsewhere in the stands, this one male and rough with offense. "She does not have a wolf. A Luna without a wolf is without precedent. It cannot be legitimate." "The rite has no precedent either," said another voice, calmer, from a different section of the stands. And this was followed by several others, and the arena noise became argumentative, became the specific sound of 500 people disagreeing about something with real stakes. And Sable stood in the middle of all of it with her hand on Arkin's neck and her boots in the sand, and thought, with the particular dry honesty that was her default mode of thinking, that this was not how she had expected her Thursday morning to go. Silence. The word came from the pavilion with enough force that it achieved what it commanded, not instantly, but within seconds the noise collapsed into itself, and the arena was quiet. Kaelin descended from the pavilion stairs and walked onto the arena floor, and the crowd watched him the way crowds watched powerful people when they were doing something that had not been scripted in advance. He walked across the sand toward where Sable stood, and he walked at the same unhurried pace as Arkin had, the same certainty in the stride, the same quality of having decided and not being interested in discussing it. And she watched him come and felt the thing in her chest do the thing with no name. Larger again. Larger than it had been in the paddock, larger than it had been through the grating. Something that was trying very hard to be acknowledged, and that she was running out of reasons to prevent acknowledging. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, and she looked at his, and this time the looking was direct and unguarded in a way that the corridor meeting had not been, in a way that was possible because they were both now standing in front of 500 witnesses, and there was no pretending this was a routine moment in either of their days. "Sable Voss," he said, and his voice was quiet, intended for her rather than for the arena, though the arena's silence made it carry anyway. "Daughter of Lieutenant Davin Voss, my kingdom owes your family a debt it has not yet paid." She did not say anything, because there was nothing she could say to that in this moment that would not break something she needed to keep intact. "Arkin has chosen," he said. "I will not contest what he has chosen. I am not certain. I could if I tried." He paused, and she heard in the pause the weight of the mate bond pressing against his control, pressing against the thing she could not fully feel without her wolf. But that was present in her nonetheless, in the warmth on her skin, and the impossible steadiness of her heartbeat, and the fact that she was not afraid of him. She had never been afraid of him, even in the corridor, even when she should have been. "But I am asking you, independently of what he has chosen and independently of what I feel, which is something we will have time to discuss in less public circumstances, I am asking you if you are willing." She thought about her father, who had been invisible to the kingdom he served until he was not, and then only because he was gone. She thought about 8 years of service, and 1 small room, and a wire repair on a gate that had not held. She thought about Vivian Ashford's hands, white-knuckled and controlled, and the weight of the political structures that did not care about her and had never needed to. She thought about standing in the half-dark of a service corridor and telling a horse the truth about what it felt like to wait. "I am willing, Your Majesty, she said. Kaelin looked at her for one more moment, in which something in him settled. Visibly, the way a thing settles when it has found the place it was meant to rest. Then he turned to the arena, to the 500 witnesses and the court priest and the noble stands and whatever. Future was about to be built from this moment, and he said, clearly enough for every person present to hear, "The rite is complete. Vordenmir has its Luna." The noise that followed was different from the noise before. It had shape to it, direction, momentum. Some of it was protest, concentrated in specific sections of the stands, where the political implications were arriving in real time with significant discomfort. Most of it was something that Sable, who was not accustomed to being at the center of anything, had no framework for receiving. It was loud, and it was large, and it was pointed at her, and she breathed through it and kept her hand on Arkan's neck because it was warm and steady, and she needed both of those things right now. Kaelin did not leave the arena floor. He stood beside her, and Arkan stood on her other side, and together, they waited for the noise to sort itself into something workable. The way all noise eventually sorted itself if you were patient enough to wait. And Sable thought, very quietly, in the part of her that was still processing what had just happened, that patient was something she knew how to be. She had been waiting long enough herself. The formal presentation ceremony happened 2 hours later, in the throne room, with the court assembled and the priest officiating and every candle in the room lit even though it was midday, and the light from the high windows was more than sufficient. Sable stood in the center of the throne room floor in her work boots and her cleanest shirt and her practical braid, and did not apologize for any of it, because she had decided somewhere between the arena and the throne room that apologizing for what she was in a moment meant to determine who she would be seemed like an error she would regret. The court watched her with the full range of human responses to the unexpected, from open curiosity to visible calculation, to something that might have been grudging respect from the handful of people whose primary orientation was toward honesty regardless of politics. Lady Vivian Ashford attended the ceremony. She stood in her designated position among the noble witnesses with her spine perfectly straight and her chin at the angle that communicated control, and her hands were folded in front of her body with a grip that Sable noted from across the room. She did not avoid Sable's gaze when their eyes met briefly across the space. She held it for 3 seconds with an expression that Sable could not fully read, which was still unusual, and then she looked away. There was no warmth in it. But there was no performance either, no deliberate cruelty, no visible satisfaction in anyone else's difficulty. Whatever Vivian was feeling about this morning, she was feeling it in private. Sable found herself respecting this in spite of everything, the specific discipline of a person who had been trained to serve a function and was serving it even when the function was painful. The priest completed the presentation rites and declared the selection official, and the court responded with the required ceremonial acknowledgement. And Kaelin descended from the throne and crossed the room to where Sable stood, and she watched him come and thought, for the second time today, that she was not afraid of him, and that this was notable, and that she was going to need to understand it. "There are rooms in the East Wing that have been prepared," he said quietly, close enough that the words were for her, and not for the court. "You will be moved there today. You will have an attendant assigned and access to the wardrobe rooms and whatever else you need to make yourself comfortable." He paused. "I want you to know that nothing is required of you immediately. The bond is real and I am aware of it, but we are strangers and I am not going to pretend otherwise." "I appreciate that, Your Majesty," she said. "Kaelin," he said. "In private settings, I would prefer you use my name." She looked at him. The man who was the king and her mate according to a horse and a goddess and a ceremony she had not registered for, with the hay dust of this morning still in her hair, and the whole of her life in Vordenmir changing in ways she had not begun to calculate. "Kaelin," she said, trying it carefully, the way you tried the weight of a new thing before you committed to carrying it. It fit. She did not know what to do with the fact that it fit. I am going to need some time. I know, he said. I have time. And there was something in the way he said it, something deliberate, something that had heard her earlier answer to Oswin's unasked question, and was offering the same answer back to her. And she felt this in her chest with the force of something that had been waiting a long time to land, and had finally found the ground. The East Wing rooms were larger than her entire previous living situation, and smelled of clean linen and beeswax and the faint sweetness of flowers that someone had placed in a blue glass vase on the windowsill. Sable stood in the center of the main room and looked at the vase for a while. She did not know who had thought to put flowers in the room, or if it was standard practice or a specific decision made on her behalf, but she found it mattered to her more than most of the other things that had happened today, because the other things were large and political, and she did not know yet how to hold them. The flowers were small. She knew how to hold small. She was sitting at the window watching the late afternoon light on the stable yard when the knock came. She was not surprised that it was him. She had been half expecting it in the way you expected things that were inevitable, not because you had predicted them exactly, but because you understood the general shape of what was coming. She opened the door, and he was standing in the corridor without ceremony, without attendance, with his crown on this time, but wearing it in the way that people who had worn the same object for 9 years wore it, which was to say as an extension of himself rather than a performance of status. I thought you would want information, he said, about what comes next, the practical aspects. I would, she said, and stepped back to let him in, because this was her room now apparently, and inviting people into it was apparently a thing she could do, and she was going to have to adjust to that. He sat in the chair by the window and she sat on the bed, which was the other available seating, and he explained the practical aspects with the directness of a man who dealt in practicalities and found them easier than the other kind of conversation. And she listened and asked questions that were also practical, and this was comfortable in a way that neither of them commented on. The mate bond was present in the room with them the way Arkin had been present in the paddock, warm and steady and patient. Neither of them reaching for it, but neither of them denying it either. It was simply there. Your father, he said, after they had covered the practical aspects and had moved into the comfortable territory of adjacent conversation that didn't require as much navigation. The Ashfeld records were sealed. I am told this was done by the previous administration as part of a political arrangement. His jaw was tight. I am going to unseal them. She looked at him. Why? Because he served and died, and his name should be in the record, he said. Because his daughter should not have grown up in a servant's wing. Because these are things that are true regardless of what happened today in the arena. And I should have looked at this sooner. He paused. I did not look at it sooner because I did not know about it. I am telling you this not to excuse it, but because I believe you deserve honesty about what the failures were, and where they came from. Sable was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about her father, who had believed in the hierarchy, and the hierarchy that had not believed in him, and the small room in the servants' wing, and the wire on the gate that had not held, and all the mornings of 8 years of visible invisibility. She thought about standing in the arena, with the warm weight of Arkin's head against her shoulder, and 500 witnesses, and a king who had walked across the sand, and asked her if she was willing. She thought about the flowers in the blue glass vase. Thank you, she said, and meant it at a depth she was not ready to explain, and he heard the depth of it without requiring the explanation, which was the particular gift of someone who listened the way he listened, with attention rather than just ears. He left before the dinner bell. She ate alone in the East Wing room, and then went to the window and watched the stable yard in the dark, picking out Arkin's outline in the inner paddock, the ember glow of his eyes visible like 2 small warm lights in the shadows. She raised her hand to the glass and felt something she was going to have to get used to, which was the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The days that followed had the quality of a new thing being broken in, like new boots or a new season, slightly uncomfortable at the edges and full of uncharted ground. Sable had an attendant named Dara, who was 17 and enormously enthusiastic, and managed her overwhelm by talking almost continuously, which Sable found unexpectedly helpful. She had access to wardrobe rooms, and she used them with the pragmatism of someone who understood that clothing communicated information, and that the information she communicated now needed to be different, not because she was ashamed of what she had been, but because she understood the language of surfaces, even if she did not love it. She chose things that were good quality, and simply made and wore them the way she wore everything, which was without excessive attention to them. She had formal lessons with the court chamberlain about protocol and precedence and the particular grammar of Eldaran political culture, and she was good at this in a way that surprised him, because she asked questions that were precise rather than deferential. She had spent 8 years managing complex systems with inadequate resources, and this was essentially the same skill applied to a larger and more politically charged set of variables. She went to the stables every morning. This was non-negotiable. Dara learned this on the second day when she arrived with the morning schedule and found the room empty, and she found Sable in the inner stable yard talking to Arkan, and she stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, before carefully revising the morning schedule to begin an hour later. Sable appreciated this without saying so, and showed her appreciation in the form of giving Dara warning when possible, and never speaking about her carelessly in front of others. And Dara understood this language even if it was different from what she had expected. Kaelin came to the stables on the 4th day. She did not know if this was a coincidence or an intention, and she did not ask. He stood at the paddock fence and watched her working with one of the younger horses, a gray 3-year-old with a complicated temperament, and watched for a long time without saying anything. When she finished, he came into the paddock and Sable said quietly, "Give him time to look at you. Do not move toward him yet. Let him decide." And Kaelin did, and the gray came forward on his own terms and allowed contact. And Kaelin put his hand on the horse's neck with the particular ease of someone who had grown up with horses and still remembered what they had taught him. "You are good at this," he said. "I have had 8 years," she said. "That is not only what I meant," he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the gray horse stood between them, and the morning light was clear and clean, and she felt the mate bond like a hand extended in the space between them, patient, not demanding anything, simply present. She had been thinking about it for 4 days, in the careful way she thought about things that mattered, turning them over and examining them from different angles, and she had arrived at a place of tentative honesty with herself about what it was and what she might want to do with it. She was not a person who performed emotions she did not feel, and she was not going to begin now. But she was also not a person who denied things that were true simply because they were inconvenient, and this was true. Whatever she was feeling, in the way she felt things without a wolf to name them, it was true, and it was not fear, and it was not performance. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "about what you said in the throne room, about us being strangers." "We are," he said. "Yes," she said. "But I notice I am less careful with you than I am with strangers. I have been less careful with you since the corridor." She paused. "I do not know what that means exactly, but I thought you should know it." He was quiet for a moment, in the way that he was quiet, with the full presence of someone who was listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "I have been less careful with you as well," he said. "I spoke to you in that corridor in a way I do not speak to people I do not trust. I did not decide to trust you. I simply did." He paused. "The bond does some of that, but not all of it." "No," she said. "Not all of it." They stood with the gray horse between them in the paddock, and the morning proceeding around them with its ordinary sounds and light, and it was not the dramatic revelation that the narrative of the last 4 days might have suggested it should be. It was something quieter and more durable than drama. the specific quality of two people recognizing each other in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony. Lady Vivian. Ashford requested a private meeting on the 5th day. Sable agreed to it, which surprised several people including Dara, who communicated her surprise through the medium of being unusually quiet while helping with the morning hair arrangement. "She is not going to hurt you," Sable said, watching Dara's reflection in the mirror. "She is going to say what she has to say, and that will be the end of it." "How do you know?" Dara said. "Because she is a person who does things that matter," Sable said. "Hurting me would not matter. It would only hurt her." The meeting took place in a small receiving room in the East Wing, with a tea service between them that neither of them touched. Vivian arrived exactly on time, which Sable appreciated, and sat across from her with the same controlled self-possession that she had demonstrated every time Sable had encountered her. Spine straight, expression managed, hands this time loose in her lap, in a deliberate signal that she had prepared for. "I want you to understand," Vivian said, without preamble, "that what I said to you in the waiting room before the arena was a threat. I am aware of that. I am aware that it was an unworthy thing to do to someone who had done nothing to me." She paused. "I am also aware that it did not work, which is perhaps more instructive than I would like." Sable looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I am going to have to work with you," Vivian said simply. "The Halveth Coalition Treaty is still real. The border provinces are still real. The political structures that I spent 11 years building are still real, and they need somewhere to exist. And you are now the Luna of Vordenmere, which means that if those structures are going to function within this kingdom's governance, they are going to need to function through you." She paused. "I am telling you this because I believe you are intelligent enough to know the difference between an enemy and a person who had strong feelings about a specific outcome, and has now accepted that the outcome is different. I would rather be useful to you than hostile to you. I would rather the work I did mean something than be discarded, because I was on the wrong side of a horse's preference." Sable was quiet for a moment. She looked at the tea service between them and thought about the quality of the threat that had been delivered in the cedar-smelling room, and the quality of the apology being offered now. And she considered what it cost a person like Vivian Ashford to make either of them, and she thought about political structures and border provinces, and the difference between an enemy and a person who was managing their own grief. "I want the Halveth files," she said. "Everything you built. I want to understand what the structures are before I decide what to do with them." Vivian looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in those deep water eyes. The first fully honest thing Sable had seen in them, a kind of careful reassessment that had something relieved at its edge. "I will have them sent to you by this evening," she said. "Good," Sable said. And then, because she was not a woman who performed warmth she did not feel, but she was also not a woman who withheld acknowledgement when acknowledgement was earned. "The work you did was not nothing. Whatever else was true about why you did it." Vivian nodded once, precisely. She stood and smoothed her skirts and left, and Sable sat with the untouched tea and the afternoon light, and the very large pile of files that were coming from the Ashford family archive, and she thought that this was also something she was going to have to get used to, which was the feeling of problems presenting themselves as problems she was capable of addressing. The claiming ceremony was scheduled for the night of the blood moon, 3 weeks from the morning in the arena. 3 weeks in which Vordenmere did what kingdoms did when they had undergone an unexpected transition, which was produce an enormous amount of administrative activity in an attempt to give uncertainty the shape of procedure. There were decrees to draft and alliances to consult and noble families who required diplomatic conversation before they would formally acknowledge the legitimacy of the right's outcome, and Sable was present for most of these conversations, initially at the edge of the room, and then, as the weeks progressed, less at the edge. She was quick at understanding systems, the way they were supposed to work, and the ways they actually worked, and the gap between those two things, and the political system of Vordenmere was a system like any other. more complex than a stable management schedule, but governed by the same underlying logic, which was that everything wanted to continue existing and would make accommodations to do so. She listened more than she spoke in the first week, and by the third week she was asking questions in council sessions that the Chamberlain had stopped trying to answer with only diplomatic vagueness. Kaelin watched all of this with an attention he did not attempt to disguise, because there was very little in his manner toward her that he attempted to disguise anymore. He sat next to her at dinner, rather than at the traditional distance that separated the king's seat from the Luna's seat, a change so small that it should have been unremarkable, and was instead remarked upon by everyone who saw it. People noticed. People always noticed. When a powerful man stopped managing himself and started simply being, and what people noticed in Kaelin was that the controlled quality of his public manner for 9 years was developing gaps through which something more genuinely present was visible, and the gaps happened with notable regularity in the vicinity of the woman who worked in the stables every morning before council sessions. "He is gone for you," Oswin said one morning in the inner stable yard, in the tone of a man delivering a weather report. "He is gone for the bond," Sable said, without looking up from the hoof she was checking. "Sable," Oswin said. She looked up. "He is gone for you," Oswin said again. "I have known that man since he was 8 years old, and I have watched him govern this kingdom through 4 wars and 3 political crises, and the death of his father, and the weight of 17 border treaties, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. The bond does not do that. The bond is a beginning. The rest is a choice." He paused. "He is choosing." She looked back at the hoof she was holding. She breathed through the feeling of this, through the size of it, through the thing in her chest that was running out of room for the nameless things she had been storing there. "I know," she said quietly. "I am choosing too. I just need a bit more time to get used to the weight of it." "You have 3 weeks until the blood moon," Oswin said. "That seems like sufficient time for someone as efficient as you." She laughed, which was something she did more now than she had done before, and the laugh surprised her less than it had surprised her the first few times. And this also was something she was getting used to, which was the feeling of being someone who laughed. The evening of the blood moon arrived with ceremony, as it had always arrived in Vordenmere since the first kings had built the altar stone on the high ground of the palace ridge. The whole kingdom knew the significance of the night, and the knowing had produced a specific quality of attention in the population that Sable felt as she moved through the corridors in the hours before the ceremony, a leaning toward that was not threatening, but was large and encompassing, and she breathed through it with the same steadiness she brought to everything. She was dressed by Dara, and 2 additional attendants in a gown the color of deep water that Sable had chosen herself, something that would hold the moonlight well, and that did not make her feel like she was wearing a costume. Her dark hair was arranged with a simplicity that had required considerable skill, and the result looked like herself, enhanced rather than replaced, and she looked at herself in the mirror before she left the East Wing and told herself, with the particular pragmatic honesty that had always been her primary mode, that she looked like someone who belonged where she was going. The ridge altar was lit with 100 torches, and the blood moon hung above it, enormous and deep red, as though the sky itself was aware of the occasion and had dressed accordingly. The court was assembled on the broad terraces below the ridge, and the sight of 500 people gathered in the torchlight with the red moon above them was something that Sable, who had grown up at the margins of all ceremony, had no internal template for receiving. She received it anyway. She was getting better at receiving things. Kaelin was already at the altar when she arrived, which she had known because they had discussed the sequence of the ceremony in detail, both of them preferring to know exactly what was coming. He was in the ceremonial dress of the Alpha King, dark formal layers, in the crown she had come to associate with him as simply part of him, and he looked at her when she emerged onto the ridge path with an expression entirely unguarded, entirely present, entirely without the management he had worn for 9 years. And she looked back and felt the mate bond like a warmth that was everywhere at once, surrounding them both, the way warmth surrounded things rather than directing them. She reached the altar and stood beside him, and the priest began the words of the claiming rite, and she heard them as sounds more than as meaning, because the meaning was elsewhere, was in the way he was standing beside her, was in the presence of Arkin, who had come to the ridge on his own because no one had thought to invite him, and no one had thought to stop him, and who stood at the edge of the torchlight with his ember eyes warm and watching, and his posture communicating something that Sable, who spoke Horse better than any language, translated as satisfaction. "Do you take this bond?" the priest said, arriving at the formal question that the rite required. "Freely and of your own will, with knowledge of what you are accepting and what you are offering in return." She turned to Kaelin, and he turned to her, and they looked at each other in the torchlight with the blood moon enormous above them, and the whole of Vordenmere watching from the terraces below. "I do," she said. Not because she had to, not because a horse had chosen, and a goddess had decreed, and a ceremony had been scheduled. Because she had had 3 weeks, and she had used them well, and she knew her own mind. And her own mind said yes. This, here. This is the thing you were waiting for in all the years you did not know you were waiting for. Anything. "I do," he said, with a simplicity that matched hers, and she believed it completely. The priest spoke the words that sealed the bond, and the torchlight seemed to intensify for a moment, or perhaps that was only the blood moon deepening, and the crowd on the terraces made the sound that crowds made at moments of genuine ceremony, a low collective sound of something witnessed and acknowledged. And Kaelin reached for her hand, and she gave it, and the warmth of his grip was new, and was, also, in the way of all things that had been coming for a long time, entirely familiar. She looked out over the terraces at the assembled faces, and the moonlit stone, and the torches, and the kingdom that was hers now in ways she was still learning to understand, and she felt, very clearly, and without qualification, that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be standing. Not because someone had placed her there, because she had walked there herself, step by careful step, through corridors and paddocks and arenas and throne rooms and cedar-smelling waiting rooms and stable yards in the early morning, and every step had been her own, and this place at the end of all those steps was hers. Arkin made a sound from the edge of the torchlight, a low, soft sound that was not a whinny, and was not quite anything else in the vocabulary of horse sounds that Sable knew, but that she understood as clearly as if he had spoken in plain language. She looked at him, and he looked at her, with those warm ember eyes, and she felt something move through her that was neither the mate bond, nor the bond she had with horses, nor anything she had felt before, something old and wide, and deeply approving, like a door that had been waiting 200 years to open, finally settling on its hinges and finding that it fit. She smiled, not for the crowd, not for the ceremony, for herself, and for the horse, and for the feeling of fitting. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone. Who loves epic romance? Tell me in the comments. Did you see this ending coming? And that was how Sable Voss, daughter of an invisible soldier, keeper of horses, woman without a wolf, and without a name worth speaking in any official record, came to stand on the ridge altar under the blood moon, with the Alpha King's hand in hers, and the war horse of the ancient kings watching from the dark, with eyes like embers that had finally found what they had been burning for. Not because she had been chosen by a ceremony, but because she had stood in a dark corridor with her fingers on cold iron and told the truth to a horse about what it felt like to wait, and because telling the truth had always been the only credential that mattered. The kingdom saw her now, standing in the torchlight with her spine straight and her boots steady on the stone, carrying in her blood a lineage she had not known about, and in her chest a warmth she had not had a name for, and what it saw was someone who had always been there, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that the right things arrived, when they arrived, with the certainty of something that had never been lost, only waiting to be found.